Good morning. Thanks for joining us for our webinar on connection and accountability in the virtual work environment. I, several weeks ago, reached out to a bunch of people that I know and trust and asked them how it's going in the environment that we're in, and I got a lot of feedback, and I appreciate all the feedback I got. And a lot of the things that I ended up in this webinar presentation are things that came directly from some of the people on this call and other people that I connected with. So thank you for that. It's something that I think I'll do more often when I have a webinar topic, is to reach out to my community and my network and get their thoughts and incorporate them in the webinars. We don't really need to spend much time on this slide. You all know who I am for the most part. If you don't, it's pretty simple. We've been in business. This is our 21st year in business. We're leadership development people, and off we go to the next slide. So what's changed? So we sent employees home to keep them safe when COVID started. And now that COVID might be releasing its grip, it's not just a matter of deciding where our employees will be sitting. There have been fundamental changes in expectations and capabilities. And it's now about deciding how our leadership needs to shift and adapt in this environment. So there's a tactical element to this. How does our technology work? How do we decide who stays home and who comes in, and what office spaces are we now going to use? There's a lot of tactical questions. And I know you're working busily on those, even in situations where you have people returning to work. I'm sure there's a lot of logistics to work through there. I think what I want to do in this conversation this morning is provide some tactical and practical advice and commentary, but also to ask you to think in a larger sense about what this all means and where we are from a workplace and employee relationship issue. And the fact is that something pretty ground shaking, I think, has changed. And I think the biggest change is in regard to how employees view their relationship with their employer, what their expectations are, and how they're looking at the future of their job and their working life. And so that's where I think our leadership needs to step up. That's where I think we need to be more thoughtful, to be more perhaps intellectually rigorous in terms of understanding what's going on in the marketplace and as well as in our business, and to challenge ourselves as leaders. During the 40 plus years of my business career, I would argue that leadership has continually gotten more and more challenging and more complicated. And I think a big part of that is because employees' expectations for their work life have changed significantly. I think 40 or 50 years ago, there was more of a mercenary arrangement between employer and employee. I do what I'm told, I do what I'm asked, and you pay me a wage for doing that. I think increasingly over the years, the relationship has shifted to the point where the employee makes significantly more demands of their work life, and I applaud that. I think that's great. I think that we shouldn't just go to work and do what we're told. We shouldn't live a life in our work that's less than satisfactory if we can prevent it. So what happens here is all of a sudden the bell rings, the COVID alarm goes off, and people work from home, and we have a lot of complexity attached to that. Not just the tactical complexity, but the cultural complexity of what it means to our business to have some people in a physical presence with one another and some not. And of course, there's also businesses that have been working in virtual environments for years, COVID notwithstanding. And so this webinar isn't just about COVID. It's about how do we work with a distributed work environment, and what are some of the red flags? What are some of the concerns that we as leaders should be attending to as we navigate this? So let's move on to the first concept. Here's the list I'm going to run you through today, and it's not a complete list. I'm sure you could add a lot to it. I want to talk about strategy, philosophy, psychology, facilitation, organization, connection, ethics and fairness, and engagement and employee development. It's a long list. I think there's a lot to think about. I'm sure I'm missing some things, but this is based on my own experience and the input that I received from my network. So thanks again. So let's move on. I find that a lot of people are thinking primarily in a tactical or logistical mode about the work from home environment. And of course, you need to do that. You need to figure out how that works. I'd like to encourage everyone to think about this strategically as well. Ask basic questions about your business model, market position, technology, competition, value proposition. I heard, I'm not the world's biggest Mark Cuban fan, but I heard Mark Cuban say yesterday, there's two types of businesses that'll emerge from the COVID environment: those that recognize that changes are needed, and those that will simply hope for a return to normal. When I think of strategy, I think of strategy is deciding how we're going to win, right? How we're going to prosper, how we're going to compete. The work from home and the virtual environment may not change anything about your strategy, but it might. And I think, or it might open opportunities to change your strategy that could be very helpful for you in the competitive environment. How can you leverage this, right? And again, all the kinds of different businesses on this call. So I don't know, I can't tell you how to do that. I just am asking you to think about it, right? Did this change our position in the marketplace? Did this change our branding? Did this change how we're perceived in the marketplace by both employees, potential employees, and suppliers and customers? And it may not change any of that, but it's a great question to ask. And so I don't think there's been enough work on this. Roundtable discussions in your business. How did this change us at a strategic level? How do we look different, if at all, to the marketplace? And does this change the way that we compete? And can we compete in different and better ways now than we did before? And then I think the strategic question also applies to whether people come back to the office. What does that mean strategically? Is it strategically important for us to have people back in the office together? Is there something about our business model that fundamentally relies on that interaction and that creativity and that team environment that we can't afford to lose? I think, the worst thing to do right now is just to ask your employees who are working from home to come back to the office without a reason why that's important. If you can't justify why it's important to work from the office, then you should probably be thinking about whether you should ask that of people. And so from a strategic perspective, you have to be able to tell your employees, we need to work together in the office because, and you need to be clear about that, and you need to get their input on that as well, so that they can be part of that conversation. So be strategic. Again, it would be easy to take all of this and just put it into a logistical or tactical mindset, but it could be much bigger than that for your business, depending on the type of business you run. So philosophy, again, this ties into that, what we were just talking about to some degree. Workers are asking questions that I don't think I've ever seen them ask this way before. What is my working life and how does it impact all my life? What should be the fundamental nature of the relationship of an employee to their employer? What does this change about my priorities, values, and expectations for my job? I think as these questions are bubbling around in a lot of people's minds, I think it's important for them and for you as their partners and employees and employers to articulate those questions. Ask them, how does working from home cause you to feel differently about your job? How does it change our relationship? Does it make it better? Does it create some barriers? So I would ask you to be a little bit of a philosopher and think about this challenge in almost kind of spiritual, philosophical terms. What does it mean? What, for centuries, we've all gotten up in the morning and gone to work in the office or the factory or the warehouse. And now all of a sudden we have more and more opportunities to do otherwise. And again, it's not just a change in logistics. It's not just a change in technology. It may be a pretty deep change in the way that people are thinking about their work. And I think it's clear that that's happening with a lot of people. I don't want to beat the Great Resignation idea to death, but a lot of people are saying that the Great Resignation, more than anything else, is people just simply not being willing to accommodate what their job was asking of them prior to COVID. And that COVID gave them an opportunity, a window to question that relationship. And I think that good leaders right now are diving into this conversation and courageously and saying, and not taking anything for granted. So find ways to raise and address these questions in open forums with your people, and don't make any assumptions about what they're thinking. We at Path Forward believe that real conversations, real challenges, real results. This is an ongoing conversation now, I think, between you and your management team and you and your coworkers and you and your employees about how is this working? How does it feel? How does it change the way that we work together? How does it change the way we perceive one another? And does it, what do we need to do with this that makes sense? So be a philosopher. Look at read articles. Keep an eye on there's a lot of words being written about this issue. A lot of good articles on the internet. New York Times, I've seen some great stuff. Be very aware. Take your awareness outside of the four walls of your business and into the larger social questions about what this all means and how it changes our society, our culture, and again, the nature of the relationship between us and our employers. Let's move on. I'm sorry, psychology. So as I talk to a number of people about what's going on in the virtual work environment, the concept of trust came up as a really, really critical issue. And there's really two ways to talk about trust. And if you take one thing away from this conversation and this webinar, I'd like it to be this question about trust. I believe trust has been damaged in many companies, not willfully, not through any particular negative action that anybody's taken, but just because when people are not in regular contact with one another, they are more likely to make negative judgments about each other. So when you separate your workforce and they're not seeing each other and they're not having kind of that regular, almost reassuring physical contact with each other, hi, how are you, making eye contact, shaking hands, whatever it is, then there's a real human tendency for human beings to speculate and be in judgment of one another. And I think this is something that's going to be very, very important to watch out for as this evolves, is what happens to the level of trust in your organization when people are alone, and using the terminology we use in our workshop is going up their ladder of inference and snapping to judgment about things, which is just always much easier to do when we don't have a personal relationship or not engaging in a personal relational activity with the person that we're making the judgment about. So I think that that's the number one thing about trust. I think the word trust needs to be part of your conversation with your staff. I think trust needs to be a central focus of leadership in this environment and going forward. As long as you've got people even partially or in a hybrid setting working from home, I think it's just wise to presume that because we are human beings, that trust will be more difficult to establish and maintain in an environment in which we're not together physically. Now, the second issue around trust. So we have the trust, the potential devolution of trust in our organization because people aren't seeing each other and engaging with each other on a more personal basis. We also have the question of how much trust are we going to extend to our employees who are working remotely. And I think we're going to touch on this later, but this old industrial model where people will come in and they punch their time clock and they check in and they're at their office for a certain period of time, and we can see that they're there and we can validate that they're actually doing something most of the time, really comes out of this environment. I think is a very old way of thinking about work, and the idea that people need to be observed and your visuals are validate your concerns or address your fears about whether they're actually working or not. So I think that you have to extend a great deal of trust to your remote employees, your virtual employee, working environment employees. And as we'll talk about later, you have to have ways to verify that productivity is what it needs to be. So trust on two levels: trust culturally in the organization, and then the level of trust that a work from home employee is being given by the employer. Human psychology teaches us that people will tend to live up or down to the level of trust that's extended to them. So there have been a lot of data that indicates that companies, for example, that show a low level of trust to their employees and basically strip search them on the way out the door at the end of the day to make sure they're not stealing office supplies. Actually, people in those sorts of organizations act in a less trustworthy way than employees who are extended trust. Now, the problem is you're always going to have examples. You're going to have situations in which people don't do well in the work at home environment and don't produce and are distracted and don't have the discipline of the organization to do that effectively. But the fact is we have to go into this presuming that most can, and if the management structure is properly put together, and some of the practices that we're going to be talking about are followed, that we can expect people to be very productive. And then the last thing I said on that slide was, let's make sure that as you're establishing work rules, get your employees involved in establishing those. Don't be arbitrary and say, this is the way we're going to do it because we know better than you. If you think about the last couple of years as an experiment in working from home, many of the people who work for you who've been working from home now have more experience with that than you do, and probably have a lot to say about what does and doesn't work. So make this a team discussion. In what ways does this environment work well for us? In what ways has it not worked well? What can we change about that? And then the last element on psychology is the tough one here on the psychology perspective, is that different people are going to react very differently to this work from home environment. I've had a home office for 21 years, and I've worked well on my own for that time. I'm also a little more introverted and private than a lot of people are, and it works for me, but I can certainly see why it doesn't work for other people. Many other people have a much greater social need than I do. And so it has to be, there have to be broad decisions made about working from home, and there need to be personal decisions made depending on the working habits and the personality of the individual involved. And I'm honestly not sure how you level set that. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. All right, next slide, please. So facilitation, the word, facility means ease. What facilitation does is it makes it easier for people. And I'm particularly, I guess I would say, concerned about how well most of my clients are running their meetings, their Zoom meetings in particular, but really meetings in general. There's some people that believe that the most important leadership skill in the 21st century is facilitation, is the ability to create dialogue, to get people involved, to bring out the creative and problem-solving process and put it out there and make it work. And what we find in the virtual work environment is we're probably more reliant on meetings than we ever have been. And we probably need to hold those meetings to a higher standard than we've ever held. And we need to have norms, and we need to have accountability for active participation in those calls. I've been on Zoom calls where it was absolutely obvious to me that one of the people or one of the members of the board I was working with or whatever were disconnected or distracted on their cell phone or whatever. And I think you have to have really strong accountability around meetings. If you're going to be in a meeting, you're going to participate, and you're going to participate according to these shared goals and these shared understandings of what that looks like. So if you haven't gone through your organization and kind of set rules and guidelines, whatever you want to call that, for participation in Zoom meetings, I would do that. I mean, even as simple as, is your camera going to be on? Are you going to be on mute? How are you going to use the chat room? I think probably most of you have done pretty well with that, but I've seen examples of really kind of sloppy, inconsistent use of the Zoom technology or the Teams technology, whichever one you use. And then the meetings, this is always an issue with meetings. So we work with clients on meeting disciplines from time to time. People shouldn't be in meetings unless they're necessary for that meeting. And the reason for being in meetings should not be because that's the only way you can find out what happened at the meeting. A lot of people sit in meetings because they don't get a summary document. There aren't documented commitments and follow-up and information that comes out of that meeting that tells them what they need to know about the outcome of that. And so if you're not running rock solid meetings, this would be a really good time to focus on that and to focus on facilitation in general. How can I get people to engage? How can I get people to talk? Because I'll tell you, if you're in a Zoom call and there's 36 people on the screen, it is really easy to melt into the background and not be an active and engaged part of that conversation. we could certainly help you with that if you'd like us to. So let's move on. Organization. It's never been more important to be highly organized. I mean, when you're in an office, you can be a little sloppier with your organization. There's a lot of ways for people to sweep up behind you, and you can get a lot of things done kind of on the fly and spontaneously in the moment as you're passing people in the hallway. Now all of a sudden we have this thing where every interaction really needs to be a planned interaction, because we're not going to run into people spontaneously the way that we used to. So point one with organization is emphasize productivity rather than time spent. When I started working from home 21 years ago, I felt liberated from the clock, and in the sense that I found that I had really good days in which I worked 5 hours, and I had really lousy days in which I worked 12 hours. And so I think that working from home becomes a lesson in productivity. It becomes an awareness that punching the clock is far less important than accomplishing work and tasks and managing projects. So in order to do that, this is where the extending trust comes back. This is the idea that, okay, I'm not necessarily going to look at the computer logs. I'm not going to use these awful spy cameras that some companies are using to make sure that somebody's on the job at 8 o'clock as opposed to 8:30 or 9 o'clock. I'm going to have a way, a method, and technology can work well with this, with workflow programs and things, to know what people are actually accomplishing. And if people are actually accomplishing what's needed, then I think the question is, should we even care how much, at what time they did the work during the day, or whether they were on a schedule that we're comfortable with as opposed to what they're comfortable with. Second point is you need to increase transparency. Information that was available on the street now needs to be shared more formally. I think it's amazing in an office environment how much you find out just by being there. And now, you're not going to get that information in the same way. And so how do you more formally document conversations that were had, commitments that were made, and make that more public so people know what's going on? This also gets back to the trust factor, because if we don't see evidence or documentation of somebody's work, we're not going to be trusting that it's actually getting done. So it helps with people trusting each other. Hey, look what Sarah's working on. Look what Jim's working on. And I think it helps with accountability, and I think it helps with trust. One of the other things that came up when I asked people about this new environment is there needs to be new discipline in regard to calendaring. And I think one of the things that people are telling me is they're in Zoom meetings all day long. Just from beginning to end, they're in Zoom meetings. I think you need to talk about that in your organization. When is it okay to ask for somebody's time? Is it okay to block time? This is a really important concept that we've talked about for years, well prior to COVID. If you have your calendar and there's just all kinds of blank space on it, then people will grab that time. And so if you have a particular project or a customer issue that you need to work on, would it not be appropriate for you to schedule time with yourself for that work? Now, the problem with that is often people do that and it's just ignored, right? And so you have to have a really good discussion in your company about under what conditions it's okay to ask for somebody's time, or to send a meeting request that overlaps or trumps something else that's already on their calendar. And the feedback that I received, a number of people said that they replicated the old stand-up meeting idea, right? That a gathering first thing in the morning, for example. Hey team, let's all get on a Zoom call. What are you working on? What am I working on? How do I need your help? So even though the idea of a stand-up meeting is obviously people kind of in a circle standing together, you can replicate that very well on Zoom. I think that's an excellent suggestion. Just gather everybody in the morning and talk about what needs to be done, and create some positive energy for the team that way. Upgrade project management and strategic planning disciplines. I have said for years, again, prior to COVID, that the biggest opportunity I see for growth, especially in middle management in the companies that I work with, is just basic project management. Assigning tasks that have timestamps on them, and ownership, and time budgets and money budgets and things like that. This would be a really good time to upgrade the project management skills in your organization, your own and those of others, because project management really has for a long time relied largely on managing work with people that you aren't with physically, and maybe in multiple offices, or that aren't even in your same department. So if you just think about now how work from home has kind of extended this diaspora, this separation of people from one another, it just makes sense that project management becomes significantly more and more important as we go forward. So actively manage task lists with your team. This will stop you from guessing what other people are doing. Be active. What are you working on? What are your priorities? What do you need help with? What's happening this week? What's happening today? And this, I think there's a concern about micromanaging that shows up whenever I ask people to do this. It's not micromanaging if it's a joint planning process. It's a legitimate discussion of priorities, and it provides support. So don't think that you're micromanaging somebody if you ask to review their task list with them. That's not you telling them how to do things. That's just you doing your job and understanding what it is they are working on, and making sure that squares with your priorities and the priorities of the team. So those of you that have been kind of hands off, like I'm going to just get out of the way and let people do their job, I don't know if that might not work so well in the virtual environment. You can make up your own mind about that, but you don't want to be guessing about what people are doing. You want to be you want to know as much as you can about what it is they're working on and what's expected of them. The next idea, and this has come up in some of my reading as well. There's a tremendous value in building networks inside your business. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal. People who advance and succeed in business often do so because they're good networkers, because they catch people in the hallway, where they share a cup of coffee, they grab people for lunch, and those networks will be may not form as well when people can't have that regular interaction. And networks can be vital to your business. They can be vital to the career development of individuals. And so find ways to replicate that networking activity that might have happened more spontaneously in the old environment, and try to replicate it. How do we get people together for a virtual cup of coffee? And I've seen some clients doing that very effectively. I really recommend that. Let's get on a Zoom call and not actually have a tactical agenda. Let's have Zoom calls in which we just talk about our lives and how things are going, and what we're excited about. and don't have the courage to spend time with each other in ways that isn't driven by a detailed task list or a recitation of a customer incident that just happened or something like that. And then the other thing I think that I've thought about a lot is, if I'm working with 5 people and they're all working from home, if there's an issue between 2 of them, I think there's always been a tendency to triangulate that issue through the boss. I would guess that triangulation might be happen even more so in this sort of environment. So how do you get people to resolve conflicts with each other? How do you get people to deepen their relationships with each other, rather than having, you always have to be kind of the nexus or the node through which that conversation flows. And you should know as much as you can about the relationships that are or aren't being developed between the people on the team who may never see each other. You may be hiring in people now that will rarely, if ever, see anyone on a face-to-face interpersonal basis. How do you bring them into the culture and into the fold? How do you have them form the relationships between you and them, but just as importantly between them and the rest of the team? And you just need to give this thought. I mean, networks are probably more important than most of us realize they are, but they're also kind of hidden to us because they happen so naturally in the work environment that I think we take for granted how important those networks are. So make introductions, perhaps ramp up on mentoring programs, opportunities for training, open forums, that sort of thing. Now, the issue of ethics and fairness also has come up a number of times in discussions with people about this. I'll just read that first bullet point. You may now have 2 classes of employees, one that works primarily from home and one that works primarily from the office. New issues of equity and fairness will naturally arise as a result, and conflict as well. So, hey, boss, you're asking me to work from the office. I have other people, Susie, Bob, Jamal, who are working from home. And I'm not clear on why they're being allowed to work from home and why I'm being asked to be in the office. And I think there's going to be a lot of questions of fairness that maybe have already arisen for you. And I think you need to hit them head on. I think you need to, if you can't justify why one person gets to work at home and another person has to be in the office, then you need to question your own justification. You need to question your own reasoning about that. And so I have no doubt that some of this will end up in courts at some point, in terms of companies getting pinned for not having clear guidelines and justifications for which jobs are work at home jobs and which jobs have to be in the office. And if you're not doing that, I think you're going to be at risk. I think you're going to have some problems. So be crystal clear about the expectations for both classes of people, and if they're different, make sure you can justify why they are different. And then the last thing is an extension of something I think that's been happening, particularly in the tech industry for years, which is you have certain employees who don't have a lot of requirements or responsibilities at home. And in the tech industry, you've got people that put in 15-hour days. And then you've got other people that are just as competent and just as important to the business who do have obligations at home, do have children or whatever, and they work 8 or 9 hours a day. And so what has happened in some companies is there become these kind of unspoken cultural penalties or even opportunity penalties that incur for people who don't put in the long hours. So some of this same dynamic can happen with the work from home, because you may have people who are perceived very differently in terms of their value and their commitment, et cetera, based on their insistence or their need to work from home. And I think, this is where the fairness comes in, is I think when we're managing a workforce in which some are in the office and some are not in the office, we have to be very careful about our judgments of those people, and whether we're being as fair as we can be in evaluating their value. So if I have two employees and one works from the office and I see them every day, and I have another who works at home, I'd be hard pressed not to probably form a preference for the person that I saw every day. And so you just need to be really honest about that, and be very, have your eyes wide open about how the cultural perception is created in your organization around those people who work at home and work in the office. And whether you're hearing it or not, those judgments are already being made in your organization. If you have some types of employees working, if you have employees working from home and employees working from the office, there's already chatter. There's already concern about that. There's already, gee, why does Bob not come into the office more often? You need to get those things out on the table. You need to have the conversations you need to have as an organization about these things. So I think there's going to be some really interesting fairness questions that come out of this if they haven't already. When employees work away from the hub, central hub of activity in the organization, they may tend to feel more disconnected to the core purpose and the why of the business. I think a lot of employees who do work in the office feel disconnected to the core purpose and why of the business. So they may need more engagement from their managers to stay connected in the big picture. Where, what are we here for? What are we doing? That can be kind of visceral when you walk into a business. You're surrounded by all sorts of energy and branding that reminds you, why are we here? When you're working from home, you don't have that energy around you. It's easier, I think, to enter into what I would call almost like a contractor relationship with your employer, rather than a highly committed, engaged employee. And we don't want our employees to be contractors. We want them to be bought in. And you may need to work harder at that now. You may need to spend more time talking about what's our purpose as an organization. What's our strategy as an organization? Why do we exist? What's important about the work we do? And also, it's a lot of managers aren't very good at giving praise and acknowledgement for people's accomplishments. That also is something you probably need to be more organized about and more intentional about, is to make sure that people who are working from home get that pat on the back, that virtual pat on the back that they don't get from that they would get if they were in the office. The other thing, again, I talked on this earlier, a person's desire or preference to work from home may indicate some important clues about their personality and work habits. So this, again, I think is a big challenge. How do we create a broad understanding in our organization about work from home versus work in the office, while also making it a very personal conversation with each employee about their preferences and their work habits and their personality and their introversion, extroversion, all that sort of stuff. So I don't know how much we're going to be able to just simply accommodate. If an employee comes up and says, hey, I really want to work from home, and the reason I want to work from home is because I'm just more comfortable there and blah, whatever. There's a lot of good reasons. Again, if you want somebody to be in the office now, That was a given before COVID. Of course, you're going to be in the office. Now you have to justify it. Really for the first time, you have to say, I expect you to be in the office, and here's why. Those questions have never been asked before, and now they're being asked. And what a difficult challenge from a leadership perspective to be fair and equitable, and to be thoughtful about how we grant that trust to work from home in some cases, and we don't in other cases. And again, probably said it half a dozen times already. If you're not crystal clear about that, get clear, not at the individual and the group level, about why certain jobs are doable from home, why certain jobs are not doable from home, or if they can be done in a hybrid sort of a circumstance or not. Okay, and the last issue to keep in mind is employee development. And what I'd like to say, Chris, we're development people. We do leadership development work. So of course I'm going to be focused on this, but I've done some significant reading on this recently, and one of the things that gets lost now is if somebody's working on a computer solving a customer problem, they may have had somebody sitting at their side or nearby that could coach and teach them in how to address that issue. So again, this coaching and teaching will not happen as spontaneously when somebody's not with you in the office. So you need to become more intentional about how you train people and how you develop their skills. You may need to tap in and actually listen to them engaging with customers. Get on a Zoom call with them while they're dealing with an issue with a customer, because you need to replicate that useful opportunity that you had when you were working in the office to give them a little coaching. This is how I would have handled that, or this is how I'd like you to handle that in the future. So I think training generally becomes more important, not less important. And then the other thing about training is that it is an important networking and connection point for employees. If employees go through a training program together, they're forming relationships. And so the training and developmental activities that you engage in as a company can be an important way to sew up some of those things that have been distracted and have been broken apart in the virtual environment. And you spend a full day with somebody in a quality training experience, and you can walk away with an entirely new relationship with that individual that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Employee performance review methodologies may need to be changed, right? Maybe we have different ways of evaluating somebody's performance now that they're working from home. Think about that. And then feedback, both formal and informal, becomes more important. I think, it's a good idea, especially now some people are coming back to the office, to just really be a keen observer. What's going on in this office every day that is happening because we're together? What conversations are we having that we wouldn't have had if we were working remotely? What types of learning occurred? What types of conflict resolution occurred in the moment right here as we were together? And then take that and say, okay, if that is no longer happening in the way that it happened before, how do we create systems and practices and habits that replicate that, right? How does a quick problem resolution, for example, happen? And it's amazing, especially in some of the manufacturing environments I've worked with, how quickly you'll see people just kind of pod together and gather together to talk about a problem and solve that problem. Well, you need a new way to do that now. If some of those people aren't actually going to be there in person, if you've got a product engineer or a QA person or something, and they're working remotely, how do you get them into that little pod mechanism that was so useful in solving problems before? And maybe you don't. Maybe you rely. Maybe you say those people have to come back to the office. Those people need to be in the factory. So I'm not sure where you'll land in terms of who has to come back to the office or the warehouse or the factory, and who doesn't. I'm just asking you that be as thoughtful and rational and justifiable a decision as possible. So. Just got a couple minutes. If anybody has a question, wants to throw it in the chat room, I'd love to hear it. It's not always easy on a webinar to generate dialogue, but so we have a comment, looks like from Brent. Thank you, Brent. This hybrid virtual work environment appears to be here to stay. I saw a discussion yesterday about a shift or move from work-life balance to work-life integration, where the two now coexist as opposed to being separate. This is going to make it very hard to measure output, and the virtual world is going to create new leadership challenges that have not been an issue until now. Absolutely, yeah, very well said. This is a big change. This is a big change. This isn't just about us having wires that connect us and computer screens to look at. This is changing the way many people look at the very fundamental nature of their work and their relationship with their employer. And all the work that you do to address that, to be intelligent and thoughtful and observant and curious about that, I think will come back to you in terms of strategic advantage. If you're not, if you just think this is about the mechanics of who works from home and who works from the office, I think you're missing a lot of the big issues, the philosophical issues, the strategic issues, the psychological issues. And so dive into those. Those are, they're fascinating, they're difficult, but there's also a lot to be kind of wondrously curious about here. This is a really, really interesting time for us as a culture and as a society. And I think there's some ways we could go terribly wrong with this. And I think there's also some ways that we could go terribly right and come out with a better system and a better working relationship. And Brent's point about workplace integration. Yeah, that's a revolutionary thought. The idea that your work should be something that integrates with your life is a fairly revolutionary concept. Leif, can you talk a little bit more about that decision point to require some attendance in the office versus allowing full report and the effect on the team that is in the office? I have a hard time seeing, unless there's just a huge physical separation, you've got somebody in Miami and somebody in Seattle. I'm very much an advocate of at least a hybrid model. I think some sort of interpersonal activity is going to be really, really important. And I don't think you should be bashful about saying, I know you'd like to work home for 5 days a week, but I really need you here for 2 or 3. And here's why. Again, it's back to that point, I'm having to justify it. I was on a phone call yesterday with a client I'm working with, and one person was in Miami, one person was in Dallas, one person was in San Jose, and one was in Seattle. Now, I can't get those 4 people on an airplane, so yay for Zoom. We had a good conversation. We had a productive conversation. I think we actually made a pretty good connection. We were all meeting for the first time. At some point, if I'm going to have a really outstanding, strong relationship with that company that I was talking to yesterday, I've got to believe that at some point I'll want to desperately want to meet them in person. because to me, there's always something missing until you do that. Leif, I want to make sure I understand your question. I don't think we can just simply let people decide whether they want to work from home or not. I think we can ask them their preference. We can discuss that with them, but I think, and so we don't want to be arbitrary about either one. We don't want to be arbitrary about, okay, he wants to work from home, let him work from home. I also don't want to be arbitrary and say, well, he wants to work from home, that's tough, he needs to be at the office. Flexibility, right? Yeah. We're struggling with contractors that are full remote versus having staff that we're requiring to be hybrid. Yeah. Again, if you're entirely remote, even if you're a full-time employee of the company, I think it's easy for that to devolve in your mind into a contractor relationship. I'm doing work, I'm kind of billing work to my employer, as opposed to being an integral part of what's going on. Yeah, the whole contractor mentality is troublesome for me. I can understand why companies want to work with contractors. I can understand why, in some cases, it's an appropriate use of talent and resource to have somebody not as an employee but as a contractor. What I'm scared of is more and more of your employees beginning to act and think like contractors. And that makes it easier for them to leave. It makes it easier for them to not be fully engaged and committed in the purpose and mission of the company. So yeah, watch out for that. I mean, if you have employees starting to act like contractors and starting to kind of have that vibe in the relationship, I think you've got a problem. I think you need to address it. And you still need people that come to work in the morning and or in the afternoon, for that matter, and have a relationship with your company and a commitment to your company that goes beyond what a contractor would have. I'd be glad to talk to you, Leif, separately about that. It's a couple of interesting questions. I'm not sure I completely answered your question or addressed it, but we can discuss that offline as well. So it's coming up on 9. It's just about 9. I've used a lot of your time. Again, I think one of the things we try to do at Path Forward is not always just to provide solutions, but to ask really good questions, to create thought, to create conversation. I hope we've given you some things to think about today that will spur you to think more deeply about the challenge of leadership in the virtual work environment, but also challenge you and encourage you to be having deeper and more meaningful conversations with your employees, your peers, your bosses, even your customers, your suppliers about this new world that we're in. And because we're not simply going back, that's not a possibility. Anybody who wants to reach out to me on an individual level to ask another question or carry on a conversation or to give me some feedback about this webinar, I'd love to hear from you. And at 9 o'clock, I'm going to let you go because you've got other things to do. You've probably all got Zoom meetings you've got to step into. So have a good day and take care. And thanks again for being with us.